The story begins 4 years after the events of the first season. After the girl's execution, the new truth had lost its power, and the spear separated from them, thus forming their own doctrine, and as they were more radical and free, they had become the strongest sect in the country and also in the world. Now we meet Miss Sunshine, one of the spear spokeswoman who is said to have been forgiven for her sins, cause since the girl survived her execution, the spear believers try to replicate that miracle, since they believe that if someone survives this, it is because God has forgiven him. That's why now the members of the spear call this act purification, and when Miss Sunshine jumped, only her arm was burned, and that's why she thinks that God granted her forgiveness. Now we know the new leader of the spear, he is called Pinwheel, an improved copy of the crazy streamer from the first season. They had become the strongest religion because they had adapted to the events of the girl's demonstration, saying that God condemned her only to punish her parents, who were the real sinners. That is why the girl was unharmed. They used this event as a symbol to become stronger, something that the new truth did not know how to do. They also took advantage of the fanaticism to try to replicate this miracle. They tried again and again with different condemned. They endured the 3 minutes that the couple endured against the angels, and then they threw themselves on the sinner, trying to be purified by God, just as he did with the newborn girl, but so far they had not succeeded. In this demonstration, Miss Sunshine also jumped to be purified, but this time she was not so lucky and ended up being burned. Now we see that despite losing almost all his power, the leader Kim still had some influence, but it was less and less. The spear had gotten out of control and constantly attacked the members of the new truth. Not even the leader Kim was saved from this war. Luckily, he had a brave bodyguard who could protect him. When he arrived at his church, we met the secretary of the government. She is Soo-Jin Lee. She had gone to see him to tell him that this was a new era, the era of the churches, and his church had a very important role, but with the demonstration of the girl, he lost his influence and let the spear gain power. The situation escalated so much that the spear now infiltrated their people in the government, and every day that passes, they get more and more followers. The government is scared because those people have no control and they are carried away by their blinded fanaticism. If this continues like this, they could take control of the whole country. That is why the government must do something to stop them. They need the new truth to return to be the most influential church in the world, otherwise the anarchy of the spear will consume the country. For this, they decide to create a new testament using a new symbol. Just as the spear had used the demonstration of the girl, it is then that we learned that Mrs. Park had returned from hell. She revived 4 years ago and had been locked up all this time, but so far she has not been able to say anything about what she saw in hell. That is why the new truth has not revealed her existence to the world. The secretary laughs and tells him not to be so naive. If she does not say anything, they should create a story for her and make the world believe in her. This way they can regain people's faith and eliminate the spear once and for all. Leader Kim agrees with this plan, but tells him that there could be an obstacle. That's why he tells him the truth about Leader Young and tells him that he, like Mrs. Park, could revive, and if that happens, the whole world would believe him more than any religious cult. Upon discovering the truth, Secretary Lee wants to guard the place where Jin Soo-jung was executed, but the only one who knew that was Detective Jin, who had disappeared 8 years ago. Meanwhile, Detective Jin had quit his job, and Yeon had cancer and had become so obsessed with the last words of Leader Young that she spent the whole day on her cell phone. The next day, the detective was still as cunning and realized that someone was following him, but luckily he managed to lose them. When he got home, the new truth had gone ahead, and they tried to take his daughter, but just at that moment, the Soto organization arrived, and with them Hee-in, they fought fiercely, but they still managed to take Yeon. Luckily, Hee-in was an excellent driver, and managed to rescue her. When the leader Kim found out, he didn't understand anything. When he tells the secretary Lee, she tells him that it doesn't matter anymore and not to worry about Soto, because they won't do anything if they have Jin Soo-jung, because during these 4 years they haven't used the girl who survived the demonstration. She also tells him that they should advance their plans and give the news that Mrs. Park came back from hell. Now we learned that the Soto organization was aware of all the plans of the new truth, and the only thing that could ruin those plans was the resurrection of Leader Young. That is why they had gone to rescue Detective Jin. They wanted to know where he had been executed, but the detective tells him that he cannot tell him because his daughter faithfully believes in him and does not know that he was condemned to hell. And as he only has 3 months left to live, he does not want to destroy the last hope he had. He tells him that he understands but still needs to know where he was executed executed. In the end, he agrees to tell them on one condition: his daughter must never find out that the leader Jung had a demonstration. They all agree and start with their plan to counterattack the new truth and try to restore peace in the world. Now we see that Hien had his own secret base. In it, he had guarded the girl who had survived the execution. They had her there to do studies and tests because they wanted to know why she had survived the execution when no one else had done it. But so far they had not succeeded. She seemed to be an ordinary girl. Meanwhile, the Soto organization gave a safe place to the detective Jin so that he could spend the little time he had left with his daughter. But she was obsessed with the last will of the leader Young. She believed that both the new truth and the spear were distorting the message he left to the world, and only she was able to understand perfectly the message that the leader Young left her. On the other hand, the new truth was about to announce the resurrection of Mrs. Park, telling the whole world that she came back from hell and brought with her a new message from God to share with all her children. The people are shocked at this new revelation, and they also announced that the New Testament that Mrs. Park brings goes against what the spear prophesies. Seeing this, the Soto organization was not surprised because they already knew that something like this would happen. But at that moment, they see how the girl wakes up in the middle of the night to pick up something when they go to find out what it is. They are very disappointed because it was just a toy. She had grown up locked up, and this made Hien feel very bad because her parents would not have wanted that life for their daughter. The next day, they arrive at the place where Jin Soo-jung was executed. That's why they install all kinds of cameras to collect as much information as possible. Plus, one person will be monitoring the cameras 24 hours a day. He is Mr. Cho, someone who would wait up to 100 years to meet Jin Soo-jung. After 3 months, the moment has finally arrived. The leader comes back to life, and Mr. Cho is the first to arrive with him, but he realizes that Jin Soo-jung did not seem to be the same. Now we know a little of the hell of Jin Soo-jung. He revives and dies again and again, and he does it in different worlds and being different people. But in none of those worlds he is the same. It was always his father or some man who was with his mother. That's why he practically forgot who he is. Besides, every time he turns the mirror, he sees the creature stalking him. When he recovers, he asks Mr. Cho for a computer. When he checks what happened in the last years that he wasn't there, he finds out that Mrs. Park had also returned from hell. Besides, he finds out that Mr. Cho was not a fan of his, but rather someone who hated him. That's why he had offered to keep an eye on him, because he wanted to ask him a couple of questions before handing him over to the Soto organization. Mrs. Park did not suffer the same effects as Jin Soo-jung. She seemed to have other symptoms. Leader Kim tries to get her to describe what hell is like, but she tells him that it cannot be described in words, so she just tells him the emotions she felt: despair, anguish, melancholy, and helplessness of not being able to see her children anymore. Leader Kim doesn't understand anything and demands her to be clearer with the message that God sent her for the whole world, but she still can't explain it. Leader Kim gives up and tells her that from now on she must say and do everything he tells her, otherwise it will be her children who will pay the consequences. She accepts because her children are what she loves the most. Meanwhile, Hien was still in contact with Mrs. Park's children, and they had already found out everything. That's why they asked him to save her, but right at that moment, he had a meeting with the leaders of the Soto organization where they reveal that Jin Soo-jung came back to life, and now they must decide what to do with him. They all wanted to do the same thing that the New Truth did with Mrs. Park, but Hien did not agree with that. But the other leaders don't agree because they don't have enough means to defeat the New Truth. Hien tells them that she doesn't need them, that she is going to rescue her alone, but her friend tells them that they better calm down and take some time to think things through. Back with Mr. Cho, he tells us why he hates Jin Soo-jung so much. His wife started to change little by little with the doctrines of the New Truth. She became more and more obsessed with the words of Leader Young, and when the demonstration of Mrs. Park was over, she became a believer. When Leader Young disappeared, she did not agree to be replaced by Leader Kim. Moreover, when the girl's demonstration happened, she had a revelation, and that is why she joined the Spear, left her job, and surrendered her faith completely. It turns out she was Miss Sunshine, who appeared at the beginning of the story. Her husband had tried to push her away, but her fanaticism was stronger. During her first purification, it was her husband who prevented her from being burned to death, and she only ended up losing her arm. Because of this, everyone believed that she was forgiven, and since then she was no longer the wife of Mr. Cho, but Miss Sunshine, the spokeswoman of the Spear, and the last time she tried to purify herself, she was not so lucky and ended up being burned. That is why Mr. Cho hates Jin Soo-jung so much, because he blames him for starting all this. If he had said that this is a random event and not a divine punishment, none of this would have happened. When he hears this, he laughs and tells her that by being part of the spear, she felt a pleasure that she would never have felt in her marriage. That is why she preferred to throw herself into the gates of hell than to continue with her husband. Mr. Cho gets angry and beats her up, but Jin Soo-jung tells her that he has already been in hell and there is nothing he can do to hurt him. Also, the organization he helps is actually not much different from the New Truth. Both are looking to take advantage of the situation so they can gain power. So he tells him that if he turns him in, they will most likely lock him up until he tells them everything. And if what he says is not beneficial to them, they will most likely end up taking his life. So he tells him that this is his last chance. If he really wants to fix the world, he is the only one who can do it. Mr. Cho doesn't want to believe him, and when he arrives with Sodo, they tell him that they are going to lock him up to study him just like Jin Soo-jung said. He is left thinking that maybe he is right and that the Sodo organization is the same as the New Truth. When he remembers his wife, he decides to go back and take advantage of the last chance he has to change the world. He frees Jin Soo-jung and is willing to help him. He asks her to take him to the spear using his ex-wife's contacts, because the spear is the only one who can change this world, and he is sure that when they see him, they will not try to lock him up. On the contrary, they will serve him faithfully. At the same time, the New Truth and the government were making the New Testament. They had hired all kinds of professionals to put ambiguous phrases from which each person can draw their own interpretation, and without losing the original message that the New Truth is the way, and that throwing oneself into the demonstrations to be purified is a mistake and interferes with the design of God. Later, the Secretary Lee had found something in the interviews of Mrs. Park. The words that seemed meaningless turned out to be a harbinger of death. Leader Kim is frightened because she had told him several things that now could make sense. And when the Secretary Lee asked Mrs. Park if she saw something about her, she answered that she did not see anything. That is why at the end of their meeting, he goes to talk to her to clarify his doubts. Mrs. Park tells him that she sees a phoenix and a very colorful landscape. She also realized that these things she sees could be a prophecy of the death of people. Leader Kim is frightened and decides not to continue asking questions. For his part, Hee-in had grown fond of the little girl, but he had no time for those feelings because Sodo was on high alert because Mr. Cho had run away with Jin Soo-jung, and at that moment, the best thing that could happen to them is for him to take revenge, because if he takes him with the spear or the New Truth, things could be over for them. Now we see that the worst was over, and Jin Soo-jung arrives with the new spear leader. When he sees him, he can't handle the excitement and bows to him. He tells him that he never lost faith that he would come back to save them someday. Now we find out that the real intention of Jin Soo-jung was to meet Mrs. Park. That's why he went to the spear, because they were the only ones who would help him without asking and without objection. Besides, he confesses to Mr. Cho that he never cared about saving this world. He only wants to see Mrs. Park to ask her if she also sees the executioners in the mirror. Maybe she knows the way to end his torment and to say goodbye. He tells her that he ended up like this because he never took responsibility for anything. He always let others decide for him. That's why his life will end here, because he gave his last chance to someone else. The next day, everything was ready for the announcement of Mrs. Park and the New Testament. This was the time when Hee-in planned to release her. She and her partner would act on their own, and only a couple of other members would help them. But it turns out that in reality, it was all a hoax. The Secretary Lee had contacted him and tells him that the New Truth can't have all the power. That's why they need Sodo to also become a church. And so they will continue to fight against each other endlessly, so that the government will be calm and can more easily control the people, which is not possible with the spear, because its followers are no longer afraid. She was the one who leaked the information of the New Truth. That is why she planned that Sodo stays with Mrs. Park, so that both can have something to support their faith. The New Truth will have the New Testament, and that is the prophetess who came back from hell. If they cannot achieve this, it will not matter if they destroy the spear or not, because new groups could be formed, and each time they would be more extremist. That is why they need them to have a world in order. At night, Mrs. Park is ready to give her big announcement, and we realize that she did not see the executioners in the mirrors. For her part, the spear manages to infiltrate the building, and the government does the same. This will define the beginning of a new world, as did the execution of Mrs. Park 8 years ago. Now we see the two members that are part of the rescue plan. They do not seem to be strong people. Moreover, we can see that they are scared, but even so, it was the only support they had. When Mrs. Park goes on stage, the crowd goes crazy. crazy, but she did not seem to be well. Seeing so many people, she starts to see images of their deaths, but before she starts her speech, the Soto organization starts with their plan. The woman who would help them would have an execution at that instant. Then the executioners appear and unleash panic. This was the perfect opportunity to rescue Mrs. Park, but the spear had also mobilized. The leader began to transmit live to unmask the new truth once and for all. When they managed to enter the building, they created a real chaos. While the execution was happening, many members of the spear jumped on it to be purified. The government was monitoring everything. They had everything calculated and things were going according to plan, but they did not count on Jin Soo-jung being with them. The members of the spear fought against the police to enter the temple and witness the message of their leader. Hein, for his part, did not agree with using condemned people for this purpose, but the Lord says he has no choice. This is his only chance to rescue Mrs. Park. At the same time, Leader Kim was cornered, so he calls Secretary Lee to help him. She tells him that a team will be waiting for him at the end of the hallway, but in reality, the ones he wanted to send was the Soto organization, and meanwhile, Jin Soo-jung was ready to make the announcement that he was back. When the world is paralyzed, his message even makes the government itself tremble. He also takes the opportunity to ask his believers to help him meet Mrs. Park, and thanks to this, his fans managed to defeat the police and completely invade the building. This causes Hee-in to be surrounded and she has to fight for her life. She and her partner were good fighters, but there were only two of them, so they have no choice but to flee and to ruin things even more. The spear discovers the Lord who was planning to help them escape, but as he was only an old man, they wanted to let him go. Jin Soo-jung heard everything, and for some reason he knew that his demonstration would be soon, and that he worked with the Soto organization. That is why they captured him to ruin their plans. At the same time, Mrs. Park kept repeating that the world had come to an end, but everyone thought she was crazy. Seeing that things had gotten out of control, the government wanted to abort all the missions, but the Secretary Lee tells them that the priority is to get Mrs. Park out, and then they will see what happens. But the spear had found Leader Kim, and Soto had also arrived, and Hee-in tells Leader Kim that it is time to return the favor. Just like 8 years ago, he is going to deliver him with the spear. They surround him, and in his last act of desperation, he calls the Secretary Lee, but she hangs up on him because she no longer needs him. The government only kept alive the people who were useful to them. Then the spear enters the room and Leader Kim continues to claim that he is the true emissary of God. But at that moment, Jin Soo-jung appears, and in his desperation, Leader Kim shouts the whole truth, but no one seems to believe him. Then he finally understands the words of Mrs. Park. He sees the phoenix and a beautiful landscape. Mrs. Park really was able to see the last things that people see before they die. And when they finish with Leader Kim, the whole country had become chaos. Riots were happening everywhere, and at that time, Jin Soo-jung had discovered Leader Kim's phone, so he dials the Secretary Lee to tell her that he already knows everything. Apparently, he also had a skill, because he could decipher everything with a couple of clues. Practically, they couldn't lie to him, so he threatens the government with unleashing a real catastrophe if they don't give him what they want, which was to talk to Mrs. Park. For his part, Hee-in manages to make Mrs. Park calm down, but she tells him that she sees an elephant drawn, and that is where she will die. Now she seems to understand better how her power works. After changing, she regains her sanity, and the first thing she does is to ask for her children. Hee-in tells her that when all this is over, she will be able to see them. At the same time, it was time for the demonstration of the Lord. The spear was going to transmit it live, and they would take advantage of it to flee, but the government had given in to Jin Soo-jung's threats and warned them in advance. That's how they managed to capture them, and Jin Soo-jung was finally able to meet Mrs. Park. When he talked to her, he asked her if she also saw the executioners approaching through the mirrors. She doesn't understand what he is talking about, and when he tells her about hell, she tells him that her hell was very different. In all the world she was in, she was always the mother of her children and was never other people. That only happened to Jin Soo-jung. This means that each person has their own hell, and the condemnations are not based on their sins, but rather on their weaknesses. This would explain why Mrs. Park tells him that when he looks in the mirror, he sees nothing, which means that these monsters are not behind him, but inside Jin Soo-jung, because he had not changed. He was still the same coward who made everyone afraid so as not to feel isolated and alone. He gets angry and decides to face the mirror, and it turns out that the monsters do not attack him. But Mrs. Park was right in the end, because the monsters don't come out of the mirror, but out of Jin Soo-jung himself. Everyone is perplexed to see how God's God's messenger was transforming into an executioner. When they try to help him, he attacks them and everyone panics. Hee-in takes advantage of this to run away with Mrs. Park, but before leaving, Jin Soo-jung implores her to save him. She tries to help him, but it was too late for him. He completely transforms into an executioner, and in the presence of everyone, he is executed from the inside. Translated with Deeple.com, free version. After that, the whole world is silent. No one knows what to say, and there was not a single comment on social networks. People are disappointed. Everything they believed in had been nothing more than a hoax. The government, for its part, wanted to continue with its plan to destroy the spear and make Soto and the new truth face each other eternally. While they were walking, she saw a drawing of an elephant and realized that she was going to die in that place because her partner had betrayed her. He wanted to finish with Mrs. Park because while she was alive, someone else could use her and the world would become even more chaotic. But before leaving, the traitor tells her that if she lets her go, the last chance they have to restore the world will also be gone. Then we see that a mysterious man appears to take her away. Before saying goodbye, he tells Hee-in that the world will soon come to an end. That's why she must do what her heart tells her. Now we discover that the mysterious man was actually her son, Mrs. Park. Thanks God for allowing her to see her children again before the world ends. Meanwhile, in the city, an emissary appears and condemns the secretary, Lee, but it was not only her. This was an unprecedented event that would mark a before and after in the history of mankind. At the same time, Yeon dies, seeing the image of her mother, and Hee-in decides to follow the advice of Mrs. Park and goes to look for the girl to tell her that from now on they will live together. Also tells her the truth about her parents and tells her that from now on she will be her mother. In the final scene, we see that the girl never survived the execution, but had returned from hell as Mrs. Park and Jin Soo-jung apparently all returned after spending some time in hell, and as she was a newborn, her time was very brief, and this is how the second season of Heading to Hell ends. I hope you liked the video. If so, I invite you to leave me a like and subscribe to the channel to not miss any video.